So at this time, Bob Wilbur will be introducing our guest speaker for the evening.
I'd like to play a very brief video that will help you appreciate a little more detail. Wentworth has had a monumental impact on conservation in the United States.
I was so delighted when Rand Wentworth was my successor.
He is a man of vision, and he is a man who has an unbelievable passion for conservation.
No one could have done a better job than Rand.
He took an organization that was fledgling and entrepreneurial and still trying to find its footing.
And built it through wisdom and strategy and smarts and kindness.
Assembling just a great team that he's been the quarterback of.
He brings people together around conservation, and his passion for what we do has been unparalleled.
Great speaker. If you've heard him speak, he's off the charts.
The way he's able to connect with people.
Motivating all of us to do our best work and keeping us together at the same time.
But then also, in a one-on-one setting, there's no one else around. It's just you and Rand.
Rand has always been open to new ideas, but always bringing it around to, okay, so how would our members use that?
What Rand has delivered is a more sophisticated, a more mature, and a more accountable network of land trusts.
It's great to see what can happen to an organization that has been in direction. Stabilized, some wins.
Without his strong leadership, I don't know that we would have made it through a number of crises that really challenged our work.
He was able to guide the establishment of terra firma, which means there's a backstop for actually defending the interests in land that land trusts hold.
And making sure that we can really defend land in perpetuity.
The accreditation program, which has made a world of difference in the professionalism of land trusts.
Which is the thing which I think is going to turn out to have the greatest long-term impact on the conservation community.
Pace, quality, and permanence. I think that was his charge, and that's his legacy.
It's going to benefit land trusts all over the country.
He has led the land trust community in a great new direction, expanded the funding opportunities for land conservation organizations.
Decades from now, we're going to look back and say, this is an extraordinary impact that the Alliance has had on the world through Rand's extraordinary vision and his extraordinary work.
We leave such a stronger land trust community and legacy going forward. We just can't thank him enough.
So we'll miss him, and thank you, Rand.
Thanks so much for your great leadership over so many years.
Thanks for all the wonderful work you've done, not just for us, but for future generations.
We are really, really going to miss you.
Okay, so some of you might have noticed there was a person who looked a lot like me in there. And anyone who would have a video come out looking so dorky as I looked in that video is simply owed a favor, and that brings us full circle to tonight. So Rand is an old friend, and I'm proud to be able to say that. The two other things that I want to say, just so you know who he is. In overseeing the land trusts in the United States that have protected over 50 million acres of land, he was the one who led the charge on the enhanced federal tax incentives for conservation that have tripled the pace of conservation easement protection in the United States. That wouldn't have happened if not for Rand Wentworth, and those were made permanent about 2 years ago, just about 2 years ago, and so that's a huge, huge accomplishment. The other one that I would mention is, for those who follow conservation a lot, somewhere around 2000, a few years after, there was kind of a crisis where the Washington Post ran some stories about some land trust transactions that involved fraudulent appraisals and inflated appraisals, let me put it that way. And there was a lot of dark clouds hovering and a lot of talk about changes in the IRS tax code and or Congressional Oversight Committee. And Rand really helped avert that as well. And so personally, I think that one is just as significant. And so with that, I want to ask all of you to join me in giving a warm Stow welcome to our friend Rand Wentworth.
Well, it is a warm welcome, and thank you all. There's really three reasons I'm here tonight. And one is Bob Wilbur for his leadership, and I'm so pleased that after John's long service that Bob has agreed to step up to be president of the board. So that bodes well for this organization and for this community. And the second is an old neighbor of yours named Rob Bowers, who some of you may remember moved away about 12 years ago. But Rob is one of my best friends. It just happens that he was on the board of the Stow Conservation Trust. And finally, now I've just blanked out, Tom Shepard, who, yes. Who I just had gotten to know over the years and found him to be a man of just compassion and presence and encouragement and everything that you know about him so well. So when Bob invited me to come, I said, well, there's three really good reasons to be here. And tonight I want to talk about the healing power of the land. And I want to talk about just three things about that. First, the physical healing from the land, but then also the emotional healing and the civic healing. And to get us into this, I want to tell a story. So let me make sure I run this. Yeah. So we're going to look at physical health, emotional health, civic health. We got that. All right. So I'm going to take you back in history. This is going to be a history lesson. Can everyone hear me okay? This thing's got a little feedback on it. Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt wore wire-rimmed glasses, had a big bushy mustache. He was a stout 220 pounds, just 5'9". A reporter at the time said that he was an electric battery of unstoppable energy. This is a man who at the time was the most famous person in the world. He was running for president under the Bull Moose Party. Theodore Roosevelt was on October 14th, 1912 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He had just finished a campaign event at the Gilpatrick Hotel. He was leaving the hotel to make a speech to 10,000 people who were waiting for him in the municipal auditorium. He stepped out of the Gilpatrick Hotel, about to go make this speech. He waves to his well-wishers. He's about to get into a car that's waiting for him when a deranged saloon keeper named John Schrank, with a Colt revolver at 5 feet, shoots him in the heart. Teddy Roosevelt keels back into the seat. The bullet had been slowed somewhat by the eyeglass case that was in his pocket and the 50-page speech that he had folded double over and stuffed in his pocket. Theodore Roosevelt, no stranger to bullets from his time in the Spanish-American War and the charge of San Juan Hill, as cool as a cucumber, he coughs 3 times into his hand, sees there's no blood, deduces that the bullet had not penetrated his lungs, and instructs his driver to take him to the municipal auditorium with the bullet lodged in his ribs. Theodore Roosevelt gets on stage. Now his speech is ruined. He speaks for over an hour without notes. At the climax of the speech, he pulls out of his vest coat a speech, points to the bullet hole and the blood dripping down, and it says, "It takes more than this to stop a bull moose." Now, Theodore Roosevelt is a model for us of strength, of vitality, of almost superhuman energy. But it was not always that way. Those of you who read a little history may know the story that when he was a little boy, he had severe asthma, and he was painfully nearsighted. His parents hadn't taken him to an eye doctor, so they just thought he was kind of slow. But the boys that he played with tormented him mercilessly. They were just, he's like stupid or slow, or you can't catch the ball. So Theodore Roosevelt sought out time alone in nature. He became very skilled, actually, at drawing animals and birds. And by the time he was 20 years old, he'd published a book entitled The Birds of the Adirondack Mountains. Theodore Roosevelt found in nature this kind of refuge where he could feel whole. As he grew, he kind of determined that he would remake himself, that he would just transform himself by sheer willpower. And time passed. He ended up going to Harvard. He graduated from Harvard, moved back to New York, married, joined the Republican Party, and was elected to the legislature in Albany. In the way that tragedy sometimes forms us, on a single day, Theodore Roosevelt's wife and mother both died on the same day in the same house. His wife of complications of childbirth and Bright's disease, and his mother from typhus. Roosevelt had a long history of keeping a daily diary, and on this day he just wrote 8 words. He wrote, "The light has gone out in my life." There it is. So Roosevelt quit politics, sold his house in New York, and he moved out, bought a ranch in the Badlands in the Dakotas. And for the next 2 years, he slept out under the stars. He spent his days on horseback. He was just up close, personal with nature. And he attributes to that time in nature for rebuilding his heart, his strength, his optimism, his energy. And I like to think that Theodore Roosevelt repaid his debt to nature by protecting land once he became president. Here's Muir Woods in Marin County, California. Crater Lake, Mesa Verde, the Grand Canyon. A total of 5 national parks, 51 wildlife refuges, a total of 150 national forests, 230 million acres protected while he was president. That's more land than any president had protected before or certainly since. When Theodore Roosevelt concluded his time as president in a speech, he said, "There can be no greater issue than that of conservation in this country." Roosevelt lived with that bullet lodged in his ribs for the rest of his life. So we know that Roosevelt was a robust outdoorsman. He had a profound and personal sense of how the land healed him. Now we have a changing landscape. 100 years later, in the next 33 years, the U.S. population will grow by another 100 million people. At the pace that we're sprawling in places other than Stow, that will mean a tripling of the amount of land that's covered by roads and buildings and parking lots. So what does that mean for health? Children will be spending half as much time outdoors as their parents did. Teenagers already spend an outrageous amount of time in front of one screen or another. Now 8 years, one researcher says that in the past year that's changed. It's now 9 hours. So when I became a conservation supporter, my first job with the Land Trust was as a volunteer intern in 1969. I thought our challenge was to protect endangered species, and concerned about the extinction of species. But the writer Robert Pyle says he's concerned about the extinction of experience. What will it mean when our children can't grow up running through the woods and playing in the fields and climbing trees and walking up a stream and turning over a rock and seeing what kind of salamander or tadpole might be under that in the stream. In Roosevelt's time, the great pandemic fears were of typhus and smallpox and typhoid and yellow fever. But today, our greatest concern are a pandemic of inactivity, what one researcher calls a pandemic of inactivity. We found that our great challenges are obesity, diabetes, heart disease, ADHD, and we found that one of the greatest ways to control those are time in nature. Now, research has shown that outdoor activity can control weight and help us heal faster after surgery. It can help control stress. A friend of mine who's a medical doctor in England named William Byrd was at a medical conference where, if you've any doctors here, okay. So basically at a medical conference, one person presents a paper after another about a new drug that they're testing, and William Byrd, who has a little mischievous sense of humor, got up and said, I'm presenting on a new drug that's been through trial phase called Fitorex. It says Fitorex has been demonstrated conclusively to reduce heart disease, reduce the incidence of cancer, very effective in weight control, reverses depression, and it has absolutely no side effects. And all the doctors in the audience were leaning forward in their chairs and they said, tell me about this. When will it be approved by the FDA? I'd like to use it with all my patients. And then he revealed to them that it was walking in nature. And they all got disappointed and booed. So, another friend of mine, Dr. Frances Ming Kuo, is at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. And she's really interested in ADHD, young people, and she has young people, teenagers who've already been diagnosed with ADHD, and she takes a control group and they go for a 20-minute walk through the middle of town, along a road, trucks going by. The other group goes on a walk on a woodland trail with the sun coming through the leaves, ferns, birds, a little breeze, and then they put the two together behind a one-way mirror. And the graduate students have been trained to watch for symptoms of ADHD, do their testing. This has now been peer-reviewed, it's been published, and her conclusion is that this walk in nature, as opposed to just exercise, the walk in nature, is the equivalent to a dose of Ritalin at peak effectiveness. This is a breathtaking finding, and something that I think if we can have the mothers and fathers who are concerned about this and all kinds of health, obesity, diabetes, etc., that this story about health will open the doors for public support and public funding for our work going forward. And indeed, in this great land trust community that I've been a pleasure to be part of, some 1,100 land trust members of the Land Trust Alliance. There are another few hundred that are not. But I've gotten to know many. The Freshwater Land Trust in Birmingham, Alabama, got very creative. They joined forces with the public health officials in Birmingham. They got very clever. They applied for tobacco settlement funds, received the grant, and have now used it to design and now develop a metropolitan-wide system of walking trails around Birmingham, combating both smoking and obesity in one very creative stroke. And in Detroit, the Six Rivers Land Trust is working with the Henry Ford Hospital to build a therapeutic walking trail now in the woods around the hospital. This makes great sense. Well, I said I'd talk about three things. First, physical health. Second, now, emotional health. If you're like me, traffic jams, rushing, and then the reports of one hurricane after another at catastrophic levels, wildfires in the West, and then tweets that make me think about the threat of thermonuclear war. Anxiety, I think, is the normal human reaction to this kind of pace, rushing, and concern. And in fact, there was a study published 2 years ago in the journal Management Science that found that work-related stress accounts to $190 billion a year. $190 billion, just that's a B as in boy, in health-related costs. Just think if the Stow Land Trust could get just a small part of that to do the work that you're doing to ensure health in your town and the same in towns across the country. Well, there's reasons that nature may help, and here's why. The Swiss physicist, bear with me on this here, the Swiss physicist Nicolas Gisot, did I get it right? Jean-Paul, did I get it right?
Close.
All right, Gisot, all right. I don't know French. Anyway, he conducted an experiment in Geneva in which he separated two photons, and photon is the smallest, tiniest particle of light possible, by 7 miles. Now imagine if you and I were separated by 7 miles, right? And I raised, and we can't see each other, right? There's no contact. I raised my right hand. Would you automatically and instantly raise your right hand? No. Okay, traditional science tells us that nothing can move faster than the speed of light. But Gisot, his experiment was when one photon changed its polarity, that other photon that's 7 miles away instantly changed its polarity with no observable physical communication. And it made that change faster than the speed of light. Now, I see some eyebrows being raised. Niels Bohr, the Danish physicist, once said, anyone who is not shocked by quantum theory has not understood it. I don't claim to understand it, but I am shocked. Outside the bounds of energy, time, and space, there is what one physicist calls a veiled reality that connects all of us and all things. We see this connection everywhere. The hummingbird that carries pollen from flower to flower. And the red knot, here's a picture of a red knot. It has a brain about the size of a cashew, but somehow it knows how to fly from Brazil, where it spends its winters, to the Arctic each spring. And it arrives on the beaches of the Delaware Bay, famished, but exactly when billions of horseshoe crab eggs wash on shore. And the steelhead trout knows its way from the Atlantic Ocean to the freshwater stream of its birth. We too carry this ancient way of knowing. The experience of our ancestors from 50,000 years ago still echoes in our bones. Living on the savannah, they knew the smell in the air just before it started to rain. They knew the tracks of animals, the pull of the moon. As they slept under the stars, they felt a profound connection with the land, the rivers, the sky. We too are designed to be in relationship with the natural world, what E.O. Wilson calls biophilia. When we are in nature, we understand that we are connected to a vast community of all living things. And seeing that we are not alone, that we are in relationship with something that is so much bigger and ancient and deep in wisdom than we ourselves. In that connection, our anxieties are calmed, our spirits rise, and we begin to feel at peace. Now, we know all this to be true for those of us in this room, but sometimes it helps to have science confirm our common sense. So Stephen and Rachel Kaplan of the University of Michigan, let me see here. Yes. Track the blood flow to the frontal lobes of the brain after a typical day on a smartphone. constant pings and texts and interruptions, and the brain is shifting back and forth, not on any idea for more than about 10 seconds. What that does to the frontal lobe is cause a kind of overexertion, a strain, and that exhaustion leads to a kind of stress, the experience of stress. And so what they found was that viewing nature in a state of what they call soft fascination actually rests the frontal lobes, reduces stress. Okay, so if you ever wondered why you felt better after a walk in nature, here's what the scientists tell you, what you already know. Well, it's not just the scientists, and it's not just those of us in land trusts. The rage in Japan now, and also in Korea, is something called forest bathing. Have you heard of this? What a wonderful idea. So they actually have doctors and nurses at the entrance to these designated forest bathing sites, and they will take your blood pressure as you go into your trail. And then there's this kind of walking meditation practice that people use. What they've demonstrated, look at this, a 5 to 7% drop in blood pressure after an hour walk, and a 53% decrease in stress. Extraordinary results. This is what our dear friend and neighbor, that's Walden Pond, in case you didn't recognize it, Henry David Thoreau called 100 some years ago, the tonic of wildness. Well, I want to tell you about a story. The first job I had after I got out of college was taking court-referred kids out on wilderness trips. They were teenagers from the inner city, and we would take them up to the Boundary Waters Wilderness in northern Maine and go canoeing for 2 weeks. And most of these young men had gotten in trouble. They had either gotten in fights or they'd stolen something. But there was one who we will call confidentially Sammy. He had killed somebody. He was just 15. He told me that he didn't mean to. It was an accident. I was a little nervous about going out with somebody who kills people, for 2 weeks in the wilderness. But we got to know each other. After 2 weeks of paddling from lake to lake, cooking and cleaning dishes together, we got to know each other. We developed some trust. And on our last night, before we were going back to the city, I encouraged Sammy, in this perfectly still night, to put on his life jacket, paddle alone out in his canoe, and just to lie down in the bottom of the canoe and look up to the sky. And he agreed to do that, and he paddled alone out into the dark. And it was a moonless night. The stars sparkled like diamonds set in the gauzy white film of the Milky Way. Dozens of meteorites streaked across the sky, and then the aurora borealis shimmered blue and green in these kind of waves of energy. Sammy was not alone on the lake that night. All of the universe cradled him in its vast and forgiving arms. Finally, I just want to recognize our third kind of healing. These have been tough times in the civic life of this nation. The opportunity, I never thought I'd see the day of such coarse and self-serving and just nasty discourse. And environmental protection, which once was the work of bipartisan cooperation, has become a divisive issue in this realm of abortion and immigration, driven, I think, largely by campaign funding from coal companies and anti-environmental ideologues. And they're working hard to undo some 50 years of progress in environmental protection, and that's hard. But I think there's some reasons for hope, and one of those Bob referred to, that land trusts around the country over the past 10 years got to know their elected officials to talk to them about increasing the tax incentives for the donation of conservation restrictions. Or in the case where it's a gift sale, I assume we get a little tax incentive, even if there's some partial purchase. This was a real lesson in democracy, right? Because most land trusts hadn't been really active in lobbying or political work. But we learned the lesson, as they say in Washington, D.C., that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And we were about to be on the menu. And by building relationships, as land trusts in Massachusetts have done with their congressional delegation, but imagine that you're now part not just of Massachusetts with Elizabeth Warren, who's beautifully progressive, but you're part of a national community of 1,100 groups with 8,000 board members and 8,000 staff, 16,000 board members, 4.3 million members. So this is a big community. And we all got to know our members of Congress. In the end, at this time, even with this divisive climate, we were able to get 311 co-sponsors for this bill, a majority of the Democrats and a majority of the Republicans. So there was evidence for me that we can build a bridge, and that land might be this opportunity to build a bridge. And this is not new. Back in 1972, the Cuyahoga River caught on fire outside of Cleveland, right? The Clean Water Act was passed, with 90% of the Republicans in the House voting for it. Just this past July, I celebrated the cleanup of the Charles River, which the EPA now ranks as A-, which is pretty darn good. I went swimming in the Charles River the Charles River Conservancy had a big organized celebration, and the water was the scale where you should not have physical contact with the water was 110 parts per million, and we were at 3 parts per million. So it was a healthy water body. Second reason for hope. You may remember when the ozone layer there was a hole in the ozone layer, and the international community, environmentalists, Democrats, Republicans came together and signed the Montreal Protocol, which led to the transition to an ozone-safe hydrocarbon refrigerant. And third, finally, the acid rain, was killing our northeastern lakes. And in the 1990 Clean Air Act, Republicans, Democrats came together for a market-based approach to reduce the emissions of sulfur dioxide and calling for scrubber technology. And the results are that our northeastern lakes are coming back to health. So there was another time in history where we felt this really edgy, harsh, divisive conflict in our politics. And this was when Abraham Lincoln had just been elected. Civil War was looming. And in Lincoln's first inaugural address, he said, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." And he placed, as you'll recall, his hope in the better angels of our nature. So, over these past months, since the last election day, I've seen this decline, but I believe that conservation of land brings out the best in us and brings out the better angels of our nature. I believe that land is the opportunity to bridge the partisan divide, to reveal what's the very best in America. And I think if we come together on this common ground, it bodes well for us finding other places where we can stand together. No matter how we vote, we share a deep love of this land and its beauty, and that, I think, reminds us of what is good about America. Well, land conservation, I think, is one of the most hopeful signs of our young democracy. Those of us who support conservation can start in our own lives by modeling decency, neighborliness, respectful dialogue. And when we disagree, we can do that without being disagreeable. Wherever possible, I think environmentalists should lead by being positive, by being optimistic, by celebrating what's good for our communities and about caring for the people as well as the creatures. I said that we would talk tonight about physical health, emotional health, and civic health, and how nature helps us with each of those. And I'd like to just close by celebrating that over the past 40 years, the visionary leaders, the board members, the volunteers, the financial supporters, the members of the Stow Conservation Trust, and your partners in the town have just done extraordinary things. 40% of the town permanently protected as forest and trails and agricultural lands. This is an extraordinary legacy, and this is a dynamic and a successful volunteer-run community organization. Doesn't this sound to you like what America is about? I mean, what America should be about. Now it's our turn to save Stow's farm, and a big thanks to everyone who's already given, and a real warm encouragement for the rest to join in and be part of this great work. I believe that land conservation is just the most rewarding and important work that any of us can do with these short and precious lives that we have. And the people who I've seen who give of their time and of their volunteer time and their gifts to conserve a place that they love are some of the happiest people in the world. Well, nature healed Theodore Roosevelt, and it invited him into a new way of living, and it can do the same thing for each of us. You remember Robert Frost's poem? He said, "I am only going out to clear the pasture spring. I shan't be gone long. You come too." And this, I believe, is the highest purpose of land conservation. We reconnect people to the places that bring life and healing. We remind people of the presence of the beauty all around us. We invite people back home. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Speaker.
Thank you, John.
There's some cider on you.
Thank you very much.
Very nice.
Thank you. Pleasure, Paul.